In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination, some stories cut deeper than any blade. This is the account of Marcus Rodriguez, a young man whose journey from mockery to legend would forever change the meaning of courage in the eyes of those who witnessed it. What started as cruel laughter in a military training facility would end with a silence so profound that grown soldiers would later speak of it only in whispers. The Iron Wolf Order, a command so rare, so sacred, that most Marines go their entire careers without hearing it spoken. But on one scorching afternoon in Camp Pendleton, when the desert heat shimmered like liquid fire and hope seemed as distant as home, one man's quiet strength would demand its invocation. This is not just a story of military honor. This is the testimony of how a single moment of recognition can transform not just one life, but the very soul of those privileged to witness true greatness being born from the ashes of humiliation. Marcus Rodriguez had always been different, though he never understood why that seemed to be such a problem for everyone else. At 22, he stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slight frame that made him look more like a college student than someone trying to become a U.S. Marine. His soft-spoken nature and gentle demeanor had earned him ridicule since childhood, but nothing had prepared him for the relentless harassment he would face during his first weeks of basic training at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island. The troubles started on day 3. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Williams had been conducting morning inspections when he stopped in front of Marcus's bunk. The other recruits watched as Williams examined Marcus's rifle, his uniform, his footlocker. Everything was perfect, which only seemed to irritate the drill instructor more. "Well, well, well," Williams said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Looks like we got ourselves a pretty boy here." "Tell me, Rodriguez, what makes you think you got what it takes to be a Marine?" Marcus had straightened his shoulders and looked directly ahead. "I want to serve my country, sir." The laughter that erupted from some of the other recruits was quickly silenced by Williams's glare, but the damage was done. From that moment forward, Marcus became the target of choice for anyone looking to feel better about their own struggles. The harassment wasn't just verbal. During combat training exercises, Marcus found himself paired with the most aggressive recruits, who seemed to take pleasure in throwing him to the ground with unnecessary force. During mess hall duty, he was assigned the most grueling tasks. When equipment went missing or mistakes were made, somehow Marcus always found himself at the center of the blame, regardless of his actual involvement. But what hurt most was the way his fellow recruits looked at him. There was pity in some eyes, disgust in others, and worst of all, complete indifference in most. He had come here believing that the Marines would forge him into something stronger, something better. Instead, he felt like he was slowly disappearing. The physical challenges were brutal enough without the added burden of constant mockery. Marcus struggled with the obstacle courses, his shorter stature making certain challenges nearly impossible. While other recruits bounded over walls with ease, he had to find creative ways to compensate for his physical limitations. This only provided more ammunition for his tormentors. "Look at Rodriguez trying to climb that wall," sneered a recruit named Thompson during a particularly difficult session. "Maybe we should get him a stepladder." Even worse were the nights in the barracks. Marcus would lie in his bunk, listening to whispered conversations about how he was dragging everyone down, how he didn't belong, how he was going to get someone killed in combat. The words cut deeper than any physical pain he had endured during training. Despite everything, Marcus refused to quit. Something deep inside him, a quiet strength that others couldn't see, kept him going. He began waking up before reveille to practice on the obstacle courses. He studied the Marine Corps manual until he could recite it from memory. He pushed himself harder than anyone else, not to prove his worth to others, but because he believed in something larger than himself. The real test came during the 3rd week of training. The recruits were participating in a combat readiness exercise when Private Johnson, one of Marcus's most vocal critics, suddenly collapsed during a long march. The temperature had soared above 90 degrees, and Johnson had ignored the early signs of heat exhaustion. Now he was unconscious, his body temperature dangerously high. While other recruits stood around, unsure what to do, Marcus immediately dropped his pack and rushed to Johnson's side. He had studied emergency medical procedures extensively, knowing that his smaller size meant he would need to compensate with knowledge and quick thinking. Without hesitation, he began applying the cooling techniques he had memorized, removing Johnson's gear and using water from his own canteen to lower the unconscious recruit's body temperature. "Someone get the medics," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "And I need more water now." The other recruits who had spent weeks marking him suddenly found themselves following his orders. There was something in his voice, a quiet authority that commanded respect. Marcus worked methodically, checking Johnson's vital signs and maintaining his breathing until the medical team arrived. Later, in the hospital, doctors would say that Marcus's quick thinking had likely saved Johnson's life. Heat stroke could have been fatal, especially given how quickly Johnson's condition had deteriorated. But in the immediate aftermath, as Johnson was loaded into an ambulance, the group of recruits stood in stunned silence. That evening, Johnson's friends approached Marcus in the barracks. These were the same young men who had spent weeks making his life miserable, and now they didn't know what to say. Marcus looked up from the letter he was writing to his mother, his expression calm and without any hint of malice. "How is he?" Marcus asked simply. "The doctors say he's going to be fine," replied Thompson, the same recruit who had mocked Marcus on the obstacle course. They said you saved his life." Marcus nodded and returned to his letter. He didn't say anything about the weeks of harassment, didn't ask for apologies or acknowledgement. He simply accepted the information and moved on, as if saving the life of someone who had tormented him was just another part of his duty. But something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of their unit. The other recruits began watching Marcus more carefully, not with mockery or pity, but with a growing sense of curiosity. They started noticing things they had overlooked before. How he never complained during the most difficult exercises. How he helped struggling recruits with their studies without being asked. How he maintained his equipment with meticulous care and never spoke negatively about anyone, even those who had been cruel to him. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was real. Slowly, the harassment began to fade, not because Marcus had demanded respect, but because he had quietly demonstrated something that went beyond physical strength or aggressive posturing. He had shown them what it meant to put duty and compassion above personal grievances. As their training progressed through the following weeks, Marcus continued to struggle with some of the physical challenges, but his fellow recruits began offering help instead of mockery. The change was subtle at first, but it grew stronger each day. They began to see him not as the weak link in their chain, but as someone who embodied the very values they were all supposed to be learning. The incident that would change everything was still weeks away, but the foundation for what was to come had already been laid. Marcus Rodriguez was no longer just the small, quiet recruit who didn't seem to belong. He was becoming something else entirely, something that even he didn't fully understand yet. In the crucible of Marine Corps training, where young men and women are forged into warriors, Marcus was undergoing his own transformation. But unlike his fellow recruits, his strength wasn't growing in his muscles or his ability to shout commands. It was growing in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when choice mattered more than capability, in the understanding that true courage often whispers while cowardice shouts. The weeks following the heatstroke incident brought a gradual but noticeable change in how Marcus was perceived by his fellow recruits. What had started as grudging acknowledgement slowly evolved into something approaching respect. But the real transformation began during their advanced combat training phase, when the recruits were pushed beyond anything they had experienced before. The training scenario was designed to simulate real combat conditions. The recruits were divided into two teams and tasked with completing a series of missions while under fire, from paintball weapons operated by seasoned Marines. The exercises were meant to test not just individual skills, but how well the unit worked together under extreme stress. Marcus found himself assigned to a team led by Corporal Hayes, a tough but fair instructor who had been watching the dynamics among the recruits with growing interest. Hayes had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had seen enough combat to know that the qualities that mattered most in battle weren't always the ones that stood out during peacetime training. The first mission went poorly. Despite weeks of training, the team fell apart under pressure. Communication broke down, individual recruits panicked, and their objectives went unmet. During the debrief, Hayes was brutally honest about their failures. "You're thinking like individuals instead of Marines," he told them. "In combat, the Marine next to you is more important than you are. Until you understand that, you're just playing soldier." The next exercise was even more challenging. The team had to navigate through a simulated urban environment while under constant fire, locate and rescue a wounded Marine, and extract to a designated safe zone. The physical demands were enormous, but the mental pressure was even greater. This time, something different happened. As the exercise began and chaos erupted around them, Marcus's voice cut through the confusion. Not loud or commanding, but clear and steady. He began calling out enemy positions, coordinating movements, and maintaining communication between team members who had become separated. "Thompson, move to the second floor of that building and give us covering fire," Marcus said into his radio. "Garcia, circle around to the left and watch for flankers. William, stay with me. We're going for the wounded Marine." What struck the other recruits wasn't just that Marcus was taking charge, but how naturally he seemed to understand what needed to be done. While others were focused on their own immediate survival, he was seeing the bigger picture, thinking 3 moves ahead, anticipating problems before they developed. The rescue went smoothly. Too smoothly, in fact, because Corporal Hayes had planned for the team to struggle much more than they did. When they successfully extracted the wounded Marine and reached the safe zone in record time, Hayes found himself studying Marcus with new attention. During the debrief, Hayes asked Marcus to explain his decision-making process during the exercise. Marcus spoke quietly, methodically breaking down each choice he had made and why. His analysis was thorough and showed an understanding of tactical principles that went far beyond what they had been taught in their basic classes. "Where did you learn this?" Hayes asked. "I read a lot," Marcus replied simply. "Military history, tactics, leadership principles. I figured if I was going to be a Marine, I should understand what that really means." After the session, Hayes pulled aside drill instructor Williams, who had been observing the exercises. The conversation they had would prove to be pivotal in what was about to unfold. "That kid Rodriguez," Hayes said. "There's something special about him. I've seen a lot of Marines, and most of the ones who can think like that under pressure are either officers or senior NCOs with years of experience. He's doing it naturally." Williams nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing, though he hadn't wanted to admit it. His initial assessment of Marcus had been based on physical appearance and first impressions, but months of observation had slowly changed his perspective. "The other recruits are starting to look up to him," Williams observed. "Not because he's the strongest or the loudest, but because they trust his judgment. That's not something you can teach." The real test came during their final combat exercise before graduation. This was the culmination of all their training, a complex multi-day operation that would determine not just who graduated, but what kind of Marines they would become. The scenario was based on actual combat operations in Afghanistan. The recruits were tasked with securing a village, protecting civilians, and eliminating enemy combatants while maintaining strict rules of engagement. The exercise was designed to push them to their absolute limits and beyond. Marcus's team was assigned the most dangerous mission, clearing a building suspected of housing enemy fighters while ensuring the safety of civilians reportedly being held inside. The margin for error was 0, and the consequences of failure would be severe. As they approached the target building, Marcus took point despite being one of the smaller members of the team. His fellow recruits had stopped questioning his decisions weeks ago, recognizing that his tactical instincts were superior to their own. But what happened next would surprise even them. Intelligence reports had been wrong. Instead of a handful of enemy fighters, the building was heavily defended. What should have been a straightforward clearing operation turned into an intense firefight. The team found themselves pinned down, outgunned, and facing the very real possibility of mission failure. In the chaos, 2 things became clear. The civilian hostages were real people, Marines acting as role players, and their lives were genuinely in danger from the aggressive paintball fire, and conventional tactics weren't going to work. Marcus made a decision that defied everything they had been taught about proper procedures. Instead of calling for backup or attempting to withdraw, he handed his weapon to Thompson and pulled out a white cloth. "Cover me," he said quietly. Before anyone could stop him, Marcus walked out into the open courtyard, holding the white cloth above his head. The paintball fire stopped immediately, confusion evident among the instructors playing enemy fighters. "I want to talk," Marcus called out in a steady voice. "I'm unarmed." What followed was a negotiation that none of the recruits had been trained for. Marcus spoke with a lead instructor, role-playing as the enemy commander, and proposed a solution that no one had anticipated. He offered himself as a hostage in exchange for the release of the civilians, betting that his value as a Marine prisoner would outweigh the tactical advantage of holding random civilians. The negotiation was complex, requiring Marcus to think on his feet and understand the motivations of his fictional opponents. He had to demonstrate knowledge of international law, military protocol, and human psychology, while maintaining the facade that this was a real combat situation. The exercise instructors, who had expected a straightforward tactical assault, found themselves improvising as Marcus's unexpected approach completely changed the dynamics of the scenario. They had seen recruits freeze under pressure, make tactical errors, or fail to adapt to changing circumstances. They had never seen a recruit fundamentally reimagine the nature of the mission itself. After 20 minutes of careful negotiation, Marcus had secured the release of all civilian hostages in exchange for his own capture. But he had also gathered crucial intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities, information that his team could use to complete their mission successfully. As Marcus was led away as a prisoner, he made eye contact with Thompson and gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the building's east wall, where he had noticed a weakness in the defenses during his negotiation. The rest of the exercise played out flawlessly. Marcus's team used the intelligence he had provided to conduct a surgical assault that neutralized the remaining enemy forces with minimal casualties. The mission was completed ahead of schedule, and with a level of success that impressed even the most experienced instructors. But Marcus missed the celebration. He was in the role-playing detention center, being subjected to simulated interrogation techniques designed to test his resistance to enemy questioning. For 6 hours, he endured verbal abuse, psychological pressure, and physical discomfort without breaking character or revealing any information that would compromise his team's mission. When the exercise finally ended and Marcus was released, he found his teammates waiting for him outside the detention facility. Their faces showed a mixture of exhaustion, pride, and something else. Something that looked almost like awe. "That was insane," Thompson said. "How did you know that would work?" Marcus shrugged, the same quiet gesture that had once been interpreted as weakness but now seemed like profound confidence. "It was the right thing to do," he said simply. But Corporal Hayes and drill instructor Williams were having a very different conversation about what they had just witnessed. They had watched a recruit demonstrate leadership qualities that went far beyond anything they typically saw, even from candidates destined for officer training. "I need to make a phone call," Williams said quietly. The phone call would set in motion events that none of them, including Marcus, could have anticipated. Because what Marcus had demonstrated wasn't just tactical innovation or personal courage. He had shown something much rarer, something that the Marine Corps had learned to recognize and value above almost everything else. The morning of graduation arrived with the usual mixture of pride and nervousness that marked the end of Marine Corps basic training. Families had gathered from across the country to witness their loved ones officially become United States Marines. Marcus's parents had driven 12 hours from their small town in New Mexico, his mother clutching a small American flag that had belonged to his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had died when Marcus was young. But something unusual was happening behind the scenes. Drill instructor Williams's phone call had reached all the way to Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. The conversation had been brief but significant, involving words that were rarely spoken outside of the highest levels of military command. The graduation ceremony proceeded normally at first. Families watched with pride as their sons and daughters stood at attention in perfectly pressed uniforms. The transformation from civilians to Marines now complete. Marcus stood with his platoon, his slight frame dwarfed by some of his fellow recruits, but his bearing unmistakably that of a United States Marine. Colonel Richardson, the base commander, delivered the traditional remarks about honor, courage, and commitment. He spoke about the proud history of the Marine Corps and the responsibility that each new Marine carried forward. The families applauded, cameras flashed, and emotions ran high. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of concluding the ceremony with the customary distribution of rank insignia and assignment orders, Colonel Richardson paused and looked directly at Marcus. "Recruit Rodriguez, front and center," the colonel commanded. Marcus stepped forward, confusion evident on his face, but his movement crisp and precise. His parents looked at each other with concern, unsure whether their son was being recognized or disciplined. The other recruits watched in silence, equally puzzled by this deviation from the normal ceremony. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Richardson announced to the assembled crowd, "what I am about to do has not happened at a graduation ceremony in over 15 years. In fact, it has happened fewer than a dozen times in the entire history of the Marine Corps." The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Even the smallest children seemed to sense that something extraordinary was taking place. The Marine Corps has always recognized that true leadership cannot be taught through traditional training methods. It is something that emerges naturally under pressure, in moments when character matters more than rank or protocol. Today, I have been authorized by the Commandant of the Marine Corps to issue what is known as the Iron Wolf Order. Marcus felt his knees weaken slightly. The Iron Wolf Order was legendary among Marines, spoken of in whispered stories but witnessed by very few. It was a recognition so rare that most Marines went their entire careers without seeing it bestowed. Colonel Richardson continued, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. The Iron Wolf Order is given to Marines who demonstrate extraordinary leadership potential under the most challenging circumstances. It acknowledges not just individual achievement, but the rare combination of tactical brilliance, moral courage, and selfless service that defines the very best of our corps. Marcus's mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. His father, a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, felt tears building in his eyes as he began to understand what was happening. Recruit Rodriguez, the colonel said, during your training, you have consistently demonstrated qualities that set you apart not just from your peers, but from the vast majority of Marines I have observed in my 25 years of service. Your actions during combat exercises showed tactical innovation that impressed seasoned officers. Your rescue of a fellow recruit demonstrated the kind of quick thinking and selfless courage that saves lives in combat. And your willingness to sacrifice your own safety for the protection of others embodies the finest traditions of our corps. The colonel paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the audience. But what truly distinguishes you is something more subtle and perhaps more important. You have shown that real strength comes not from physical dominance or aggressive leadership, but from quiet competence, unwavering integrity, and the ability to inspire others through example rather than force. Marcus stood at attention, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He thought about the weeks of mockery and harassment, the nights he had considered quitting, the moments when he had felt like he didn't belong. None of that seemed real now, as if it had happened to someone else entirely. Colonel Richardson reached into his jacket and withdrew a small metal pin, unlike any rank insignia the recruits had seen before. The Iron Wolf Order was simple in design but profound in meaning. A small silver wolf's head surrounded by a circle of 13 stars, representing the original colonies and the enduring spirit of American freedom. This order carries with it certain privileges and responsibilities, the colonel explained. You will be fast-tracked for leadership training and given opportunities typically reserved for Marines with years of experience. You will be assigned to units where your unique talents can be best utilized, and you will carry the expectation that you will continue to embody the principles that brought you to this moment. As Colonel Richardson pinned the Iron Wolf Order to Marcus's uniform, a spontaneous burst of applause erupted from the audience. But more importantly, Marcus heard something he had never heard before, the sound of his fellow recruits cheering for him. These young men who had spent weeks learning to respect him were now witnessing his recognition at the highest levels of the Marine Corps. Thompson, who had once mocked Marcus on the obstacle course, was clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Johnson, whose life Marcus had saved during the heatstroke incident, was wiping away tears. Every recruit in the platoon understood that they were witnessing something historic, something they would tell their own children about decades later. After the ceremony, as families gathered around their newly minted Marines, Marcus found himself surrounded by his fellow graduates, but the congratulations and handshakes felt different now. These weren't just fellow Marines acknowledging his achievement. They were future brothers in arms recognizing someone they knew would help lead them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Marcus's parents approached slowly, still in shock at what they had witnessed. His mother, a nurse who had always worried about her quiet son's place in the aggressive world of the military, now looked at him with a mixture of pride and wonder. "We always knew you were special," she whispered as she embraced him. "But this, I never imagined anything like this." His father, a mechanic who had served briefly in the army during peacetime, could only shake his head in amazement. He had hoped his son would find his place in the Marines, but he had never dreamed of seeing him recognized at such a level. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when drill instructor Williams approached Marcus after most of the crowd had dispersed. The tough Marine who had initially doubted Marcus's potential now looked at him with unmistakable respect. "Rodriguez," Williams said quietly, "I owe you an apology. When you first arrived here, I saw what I expected to see instead of what was really there. That's a mistake I won't make again." Marcus looked at the man who had been the source of so much early adversity and nodded respectfully. "You taught me what I needed to learn, sir. Everything that happened was part of becoming who I needed to become." Williams extended his hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. "The Corps is lucky to have you, Marine. Make us proud." As the day ended and the new Marines prepared to leave for their various assignments, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The physical challenges that had once seemed impossible now felt manageable. The mockery and doubt that had once threatened to break him had instead forged him into something stronger. But most importantly, he understood now that his perceived weaknesses had actually been strengths in disguise. His quiet nature had taught him to observe and think before acting. His small stature had forced him to develop mental toughness and tactical creativity. His gentle disposition had shown him how to inspire loyalty through compassion rather than fear. The Iron Wolf Order on his uniform represented more than personal achievement. It was a symbol of the truth that real leadership often emerges from the most unexpected places, and that the qualities that make someone different might be exactly what makes them extraordinary. As Marcus Rodriguez prepared to begin his career as a United States Marine, he carried with him not just the weight of his new responsibilities, but the knowledge that he had already proven something important to himself and others. He had shown that courage comes in many forms, that strength is not always visible, and that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who fight not with anger or aggression, but with quiet determination and unwavering principle. The young man who had once been mocked as weak and unworthy was now recognized as possessing the rarest qualities the Marine Corps could identify. His journey from ridicule to recognition would become part of Marine Corps lore, told and retold to future generations of recruits as proof that anyone, regardless of their appearance or background, could rise to extraordinary heights if they possessed the right combination of character and determination. Marcus Rodriguez had not just become a Marine, he had become an example of what it truly means to be one.